You're listening to episode 24 of Literacy in Color. Today's episode is a special one. I'm joined by two of my literacy friends and fellow morphology enthusiasts, Sarah Paul from Snippets by Sarah and Savannah Campbell from Campbell Creates Readers. And we're bringing you an exciting morphology roundtable discussion. We're all just a little obsessed with morphology. All right, maybe a lot obsessed. And we're here to share why this obsession matters when it comes to student success. From understanding word parts to unlocking the deeper meanings of words, we're answering some of your questions, from why morphology is important to how this could practically look in the classroom. And if you're listening to this episode before March 1st, 2025, the three of us are also gearing up for the Unlocking the Science of Reading conference, where Sarah and I will be presenting on morphology, and Savannah will be sharing her expertise on vocabulary. So be sure to check out the link in the show notes for more details there. But right now, if you're ready to geek out about morphemes, base elements, prefixes, suffixes, and how this all ties into helping our students become confident readers and spellers, you're in the right place. Grab a cup of coffee or your favorite drink, and imagine you're sitting right alongside us for this powerful conversation. Welcome to the Literacy in Color podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Sullivan, a science of reading advocate with over a decade of experience as a reading interventionist and literacy coach. I'm passionate about making evidence-based instruction both effective and engaging. If you're interested in captivating our learners on reading fluently and understanding language, or as I like to call it, keeping it colorful, then you've found the right place. Each week, we'll explore intriguing lit bits and practical strategies around the science of reading and structured literacy to help you be colorful and teach colorfully. Are you ready to bring literacy to life? Let's color outside the lines and make an impact together. Hey everyone! When you think of morphology instruction and social media, there's likely a few accounts that come to mind, and that would be perhaps my own. I'm Michelle Sullivan. I am the face behind the Colorful Classroom and host of the Literacy in Color podcast. You might also be familiar with...
My name is Sarah Paul. I'm over at Snippets by Sarah, and my blog is Sarah's Teaching Snippets, so that's a little bit confusing. But if there's snippets in the name, it's me, and I love morphology, so I'm excited to talk to you guys about it today.
And Sarah's somebody that I can recognize from her handwriting now. It's gotten to the point where I can recognize your anchor charts, even if it wasn't you, I can. Well, I am Savannah Campbell, and I am the person behind Campbell Creates Readers. And we decided that the three of us wanted to get together because we found out within the last year that all three of us are kind of obsessed with morphology. And so we wanted to take the opportunity to get together and answer some of the questions that people had for us on Instagram and just sort of chat about something that really matters to all of us. So what we're going to do is one of us is going to kind of take the lead on the question, and then the rest of us will just chime in whenever we have something extra to say. And at the end, we're going to do a fun lightning round for it. So I'm going to go ahead and start. And the first question we had is just a small one. Why do we teach morphology? And when I think about the reason why we teach morphology, I always take it back to the fact that English is this morphophonemic language. And what that means is this. There are some languages that are more phonetic, which means that they have one sound that is represented by one symbol. And we see that in English with words like cat, right? K, at. Each sound is represented by one symbol. But English is also a morphemic language, which means that we don't just contend with the sound symbol correspondences. We have to think about the meaning components. And that's really why morphology is important, because when we are teaching morphology, we aren't just teaching them the letters that are representing sounds. We're teaching them about these meaning units that they can then use to help them uncover more words, not just the words in front of them. So if we teach kids the root struct, then all of a sudden they can understand words like structure, destruction, structurally construction. So morphology really matters because it hones into that second component of English, and that's the meaning component on English. Ladies, what else did you want to say about why it's so important?
I just say once we get to the multisyllabic words, that's where we have that breakdown where pronunciation doesn't always match up with spelling. And spelling is consistent, and we think English is this crazy language because we're trying so hard to match sounds to symbols and make sense of spelling that way. But like you said, English is morphophonemic, and so many words are based on meaning and those morphemes. So once we get into those multisyllabic words, as important as having that foundation in phonology is, we have to teach morphology because spelling and reading, there's so much vocabulary comes out of having that morphological understanding. And I also find that our students who are struggling spellers connect so much more to morphology. It makes sense to them.
Yeah, totally. And I love how you mentioned the spelling aspect because we know that English spelling will favor the meaning units over the sound units. And another thing that I think is so important is when we think of morphology, it's not a strand on the reading rope. It's not a pillar of literacy. But I love how the active view of reading lists it as a bridging process because it's truly bridging that oral language piece and the word recognition piece. And so we're tapping into oral vocabulary, like you mentioned. And we also are tapping into this comprehension aspect. But at the same time, it's strengthening our decoding skills. So morphology is really like the thing that brings it all together in a really meaningful way.
Yeah, I'm not a good speller. I'm really not. And so studying morphology as a teacher has actually made me a better speller as an adult.
Yeah. And I was going to go back to what you said about the reading rope because I was thinking about that too. I've always sort of seen morphology as this continuation of word recognition, right? In the lower grades, we do word recognition for single syllable words where we're matching the phonics patterns. But then you're right. It's not really listed. But what I see morphology as, it's almost like when the two strands of the reading rope get braided together. That's like when morphology really comes together because it's like the language comprehension and the word recognition are starting to work simultaneously, and we just can't pull the individual strands out anymore.
Ooh, I love that.
I've been thinking about this a lot recently.
We need a visual. Are we ready for question 2?
Yeah, let's do it.
I love this question. When should we begin teaching morphology? And how can it be introduced to younger learners in developmentally appropriate ways? I love this question because I've always been an advocate of we start morphology in kindergarten. And it's funny, Michelle and I just had a conversation about this, how it's in our language. Kids understand what you mean when you say, let's replay that movie, or they understand, they might not have an awareness, and that's the key. So we're not so much introducing morphology at all. We're making them aware of these words that they say and understand, and that can start in kindergarten. So with oral language, it can start in kindergarten, and we can start to introduce some of those beginning morphemes like suffix S, suffix ed, that they will see in print as early as kindergarten. So there's kind of like two ways to look at this. And when I think of introducing it, I like to introduce it with a shoe. So I'll come in and make sure I have tennis shoes on or something. And I will start with my shoe untied. And I'll say, I need to tie my shoe. I'm going to tie my shoe. So I tie it and I put out my fist and I say, tie. That's a word we all understand, right? I'm doing something. And then I said, and right now I was tying my shoe. You can't see me because this is a podcast, but what I'm doing is I'm holding up a fist and I'm adding 2 fingers to the end of it to show that there's that base word tie. And then I'm adding ing. And I point out those are 2 different words, tie and tying, but they both have that same meaning with tie. And then when I tie my shoe, I say, oh, it's too tight. I don't like this. I need to untie my shoe. What does that mean? And they always understand. It means you take the laces off. You're going to untie it. They have that knowledge. So then I do the same thing with my fist and my 2 fingers. And I show, okay, I'm going to untie my shoe. Do we still hear that word tie? And now we have something new attached to it. Untie. Okay, I'm tying my shoes again. Oh, I retied my shoes. Now we have retie. And they understand that. What does it mean to retie my shoe? And most of the time they say, well, you're tying it again. So I'm just bringing an awareness to these morphemes. And that's how I begin. And then I start to connect it to actually print. And so when they've learned CVC words, I right away teach suffix S. And then that's where you can connect. Oh, I have lots of pens. I have 1 pen. I have 3 books. I have 1 book. I hear 1 sound difference there, right? When you say pens, pen, pens. what sound do we hear? We hear that sound at the end, or zzz in that case. That sound is not just represented with a letter. It's actually also packed with meaning. So I really try to bring all of that in for them. And it sounds like a lot, but they do grasp it really well. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on how you introduce it for our younger learners.
I literally was just doing this the other day with my daughter. We were reading CVC words and I was like, okay, today we're going to do something really special. So you just read the word cat. What if I said the word cats? And she was like, oh, that's like a lot of cats. She knew what it meant. And I was like, yeah. And you know what we do? We add something special to the end of the word. And we're going to add a letter S. But in this case, it's not just a sound. It has a special power. I said it has a power. And it's going to make the word change a little bit. And she's like, oh, yeah. So she's reading all of these words. And it's like one pen. And she's like, oh, lots of pens. Yeah. And she picked up on it herself that it started to sound differently. It wasn't always S, and it was sometimes Z. And I didn't even have to explicitly teach that yet. And we were just tapping into what she already knew because she read the base word. And then we were like, what if we add this powerful S at the end? What happens? Pens. She didn't try to read it with a sound. And I think when we're tapping into the oral language first, we're bringing that attention to the words that are already in their vocabulary, which makes it so powerful. And I love that tying example too, because I think about William Van Cleef and Pete Bowers talked about this, but having this base approach. And so many times we want to throw all these suffixes at kids and teach them all the affixes of the world. But when we're starting with the base, that core unit of meaning, then we can expand from there. And students already have these networks. And I think the perfect example too, if anyone has small children or if anyone has taught small children in the past, the amazing, wonderful, beautiful words they come up with on their own that are not real words, but they're using the morphology that they know in their brains. Gooder, I'm gooder than you at soccer, or I read a book last night. Yeah. I love that. I think that is so special. And yes, there comes a time where we explicitly teach them the right word to say, but they already have this sense of morphological awareness within them just by having conversations.
And that's actually perfect because that's what I was actually going to talk about is my daughter is in kindergarten. She's 5 years old and she does use a lot of these affixes and sometimes she'll use them incorrectly. And I was just thinking, so the other day we were in the hot tub and she loves to like climb on my legs and she goes, Mom, I want you to put your legs more down. And I was like, so when she does stuff like that and she says it wrong, I don't make a big deal about it. I'm just like, oh, you want me to put my legs lower? And she's like, yeah, put them lower. And so I think just like repeating back the statements that your children say in a way that's appropriate both for the scenario, but also like appropriate for their age level. You know, I'm not going to make her all of a sudden do morphological awareness stuff like she cannot handle, but she can handle. No, we don't really say more down. We say we're going to go lower with it. And so I think just modeling that appropriate language with your kiddos is such a big one. And my daughter's vocabulary, I'm like so proud of it because we just spend so much time talking to her.
I love the words that kids make up too. Cause sometimes I'm like, that should be a word. I mean, I use the word, which is not really a word. I use rememberful all the time. And I'm like, I'm going to make that a word because it needs to be a word.
Well, look at what Wicked did. And I know, Michelle, you had posted something on your Instagram, but Wicked, the success of the musical, like there's so many of those fun words that are not real words, but they're like grammatically okay. I just love that they did that with the movie and the musical.
So fun.
So fun. We're on to our next question, and we're going to get into a little bit of the tools for morphology. So chances are you've seen a word matrix or word sums on social media, but maybe you're not sure what they are or how they work or how to use them. So we're just going to get into what exactly is a word matrix and what are word sums. So word matrices, some people say word matrices, both are correct, by the way. I had this conversation with Sarah. Matrices is Latin, matrices would be Greek, depending on how you are spelling it. But they are incredible tools for morphology and just exploring words and investigating words. So this is a podcast, so we're going to use our visualization techniques. But when you think of a word matrix, you're going to think several columns together. So typically it's going to have 3 columns, but in the primary grades, we can stick with 2 columns. And what you'll have is if you have a 3-column matrix, you'll put that base element, the core meaning of the word, in the middle of the matrix in that middle column. And this is the structural unit that's going to hold all of the meaning for whatever other words are related. And oftentimes there's a denotation beneath it in quotation marks where it will kind of tell you what that means, especially if you have a Latin base there, like Savannah mentioned, struct. So you would have in quotation marks build. So you'll have the base element. And then on the right-hand side, in the right-hand column, we are going to list out all of the suffixes that would work with that base element. If you have a 3-column matrix on the left-hand side, you'll list out the prefixes that will work. And you're going to be reading the matrix from left to right. You can't jump over columns. You have to go in order that you'll read them. But basically, it's just a visual representation to see the family of words that can be built. And sometimes that suffix column can get messy because you'll have several suffixes in a word. So you'll have like sub-rows with sub-columns outlining the potential ways that words can work. And then what you'll do is you'll test out your matrix with what we call word sums. So sometimes you think of sums, you think of math, you think of addition, but it's not necessarily like this straightforward equation. So word sums don't have an equal sign. They have an arrow because it's showing a process that a word is going through, not necessarily put these morphemes together equals this word. And this is precisely because we have suffixing changes. We have the doubling rule and the e-drop and the change y. So sometimes we have to adjust some things with our morphemes before we have that final word at the end. So for an example, if I had a word matrix with struct in the middle, and then I might have ure in the suffix column, and then I might have another column with al, and I might have another column with ly, I can write out my word sum with that struct plus ure plus al plus ly. Arrow is rewritten as structurally. And it's a nice way to see how the morphemes are interacting with each other to create a new word. And in that case, we had that ure that ends with the e, and then you had a vowel suffix al. So we did have to drop the e in that particular one. And if your word sums don't work, then it means that maybe something's wrong with your matrix. So you're like a scientist. You're testing out your hypothesis to see, are these tools interacting with each other properly? So those are really fun to work with. In the primary grades, they can be really simple. Like you could have cat as your base element, and then you can have suffix s in the next column, and you're just showing out cat plus s is rewritten as cats, and it could be as simple as that. So don't be overwhelmed when you see these Latin and Greek matrices with all these elements and affixes that you maybe don't know the meaning of. It doesn't have to be that complicated, and we can start out really, really simply.
Absolutely. I think about how you can take the base ACT, and for a first grade class, that word matrix is going to look a lot different than if I did it with a third grade class, because there are so many words we can make. Same with USE. The word is used, and then when we add prefixes and suffixes, we can come up with so many words. So doing that with the first grade group is going to look really different than with the third grade group. So my advice to people is, even if you're like, I don't know all the words, I can't do all, just start with something basic, because you don't have to know every single word in that word family. I think of the matrix as the graphic organizer for words, the ultimate graphic organizer for words. And I think of word sums as the bridge between the word matrix and the actual spelling of the word. Because like Michelle, you did a very good job describing that. That was very impressive without a visual. The word sum helps us to see how we get from those morphemes together to the spelling of the word, because often there are some things like drop an E or double a letter. So I just think that can be so powerful for kids and for me as an adult.
And I was just going to add too, you can have fun with it. Once you do this, you don't have to just do it the exact same way every time. You could at some point take your word parts, put them on the board, and then turn it into a game where each group has to come up with as many words as they can. And because you've been doing these word matrices for so long, they know the process. They know how to find new words. I was also going to say that when I'm working with prefixes, suffixes, roots, I like to do, and this is one of those things where there's no right answer. It's just kind of what I like. I like to have my prefixes be green, my suffixes be red, and my roots and Greek combining forms be yellow, because I kind of think of it like a stoplight. So green is go. It's at the very beginning. So they know that, okay, this has to be at the beginning. The roots and the combining forms, these are going to go in the middle, and then the suffixes must go at the end. But it's just a scaffold. It's not something that we have to do. It's just a way that we can think about providing extra support to our kiddos who might get confused when they see so many different word parts.
I love that. I love to color code them too. I personally am more of a pink than a red person, so I go that way.
Were you like personally attacked by red pens as a child?
No, I'm just not a primary color kind of person. So funny. But I had a friend, she took a training and they taught a different color coding method where I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. They made Latin bases lavender. And they made Greek bases green. And I was like, ooh, if you want to distinguish between word origin, that was like an interesting perspective. But I like to keep it yellow. That's my personal preference.
So funny. We all have different colors.
Well, and I just think it really goes back to we know what children need to become proficient readers, but that doesn't mean that we're robots with it. It doesn't mean that we have to do every instructional activity exactly the same way. We have the same end goals and we know roughly the same ways that children learn to read, but we're not robots.
I want to add one more thing about how a word matrix can be helpful. I think it's been really helpful for me as a teacher describing the difference between a prefix and the role of the prefix. Like, what does the prefix do versus the suffix? Because with suffixes and parts of speech, it helps to show that. So often what I'll do when I'm building a matrix is, so we have our base, and I'll start by adding some prefixes. And STRUCT is perfect, or, another one, TRACT. Those are perfect bases because they have so many prefixes that can go. So I'll do maybe one prefix at a time and then combine those and say, okay, what word does that make? And how did it change the meaning of that base? The base is always the main meaning of the word. So what is the meaning of that prefix? And how can we make sense of the word by putting those two together? And it really highlights how prefixes, they do change the meaning of the word in a different way than the suffixes end up being more, it's like a part of speech, or kind of, well, with inflectional endings, it's a little bit different, but often it's a part of speech. So it's just it has a job in the sentence, the suffixes, more so than where the prefixes actually change the meaning of the word. And exploring that can be really interesting. And I think a matrix can help us see that in a way that makes some sense for kids.
And that goes back to that first part, like, why is morphology important? And Savannah was talking about that as well with the whole grammar piece. You're teaching parts of speech with morphology. Like, this word just became a noun, and this word just became an adjective just because of the suffix. And that's so cool.
And when you take it back to the word recognition component on it too, think about how helpful it is to help kiddos see that these multisyllabic words are really just made up of smaller units that you already know. And if we can peel away the prefixes and the suffixes, all of a sudden it's not a 5-syllable word that you have to try to figure out. You just have a base. And if your teacher's already taught you that base, all of a sudden it's like, whoa, this is actually really simple.
Totally.
Once you sort of get like the cheat code of morphology.
I always like to use the example of the word comfortable, because I don't know if we all say it the same way. We're all from different places, but I say it like comfortable. If I were to spell it how I hear it, it'd be like CUMF, it's just like totally different. But then if you point out to a student, oh, there's only 3 morphemes. Let's look at what those 3 morphemes are. And 2 of them are very familiar morphemes that we see all the time. The prefix and the suffix, we see those all the time. And then when they're like, oh, okay, because the suffix able often doesn't sound like you would think. And you don't hear FORT, you don't hear fort when you say, maybe you guys say comfortable, but I don't. So I just think it could be so helpful being 3 morphemes versus memorizing every single letter. And I'm a bad speller because I can't memorize every single letter. My brain doesn't work that way. My husband, it does. He can look at it, he can memorize it, But if I think about 3 morphemes, I can spell that. I can remember 3 morphemes.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like your husband is one of those people that can orthographically map words with between 1 and 4 exposures.
Yes. It's really annoying. No, I'm just joking. It's helpful. I'm always like, how do you spell?
All right. So our next question was, is there a specific scope and sequence we should follow? And this is probably the number one question I get asked about morphology. And it makes sense because we have preached for so long when we're teaching phonics, we need to have a good scope and sequence for teaching phonics so that we can ensure that we get all of those patterns in. And the difficult answer is no, not really. There's really not a scope and sequence for morphology, but there are some kind of general rules that I like to follow. And that is that we teach Anglo-Saxon first. I'm not telling the kids necessarily like, oh, this is Anglo-Saxon, but we teach Anglo-Saxon first because it is the most concrete. Anglo-Saxon tends to be built of compound words, simple words, and the prefixes and suffixes that we have for Anglo-Saxon tend to be very clear. So a word like hopeful means I am full of hope. A word like hopeless means I don't have hope. So we start with Anglo-Saxon because it is the simplest. Anglo-Saxon is also where we get those inflected endings like S, ES, ING, and ED. And so Anglo-Saxon is the easiest. And then we move into Latin. But we have to keep in mind that Latin is like 50% of our language. And so we've got to make sure that we spend a good amount of time teaching our kiddos Latin. And then Greek is the last layer that we really explicitly teach to our kiddos. Within each of those layers, you have some flexibility. You don't have to teach the prefix un before you can teach the suffix full. What you want to think about is having high utility, high impact morphemes that we teach to our kids. We want to start by teaching what is concrete, and we want to teach what is meaningful to them. And that's kind of how I approach it. What about you ladies?
Same. Exactly. And I've tried to be like, let me figure out where to, and there's certain ones that I have plugged in that I'm like, I do always end up teaching this here. But I think also it's so much more flexible because by the time I explicitly taught my 2nd grade group ION, they were like, yeah, we've done that in a word matrix like 100 times. Like they totally were like, you've been talking about this forever because they see it.
I'm like, get new material, ma'am.
It's great because I explicitly taught that. I did that because there's things I wanted to make sure that they knew. You know, there were a few students who were like, oh, like the light bulb did kind of go off. It's not quite the same as with a phonics scope and sequence. And it is tricky because I'm trying to do a better job of like, okay, I want to make sure I hit this and I hit this. And you explained it perfectly. We start with the ones that are the most transparent when we're teaching and the ones that are the most obvious. And by the time we get to Greek roots, I feel like Latin roots, I'm like, okay, I could hang with those. Social studies science teachers, you're the ones who should be teaching those Greek roots because, right, they come up so much in those subject areas. So that's kind of a bigger topic, but I feel like we need to make a shift and teach our social studies and science teachers about some of them know, but I do think that they're so complicated that that's where it kind of starts.
I don't even touch Greek until 5th grade.
I don't know.
Yeah. And I love how you said there are some things along your phonics scope and sequence where you're like, this is a perfect fit. And I'm thinking particularly of like the E drop after you teach silent E.
Yep.
That is a cohesive way to just integrate certain suffixes into your phonics scope and sequence. But we can't pigeonhole ourselves into thinking morphology fits along a scope and sequence either. And especially like I'm going back to that base element scenario. If we are going to prioritize building these relatives around the base and tapping into oral language, morphology is not just word recognition. Morphology is that vocabulary aspect. So I am also not going to hold students accountable for spelling words correctly if they haven't been taught those phonics rules yet, but I'm not going to shy away from using a CVC word that uses the doubling rule just because they haven't learned the doubling rule either. I can notice and name it and say like, hey, we just so happen to double the N in this word because it's going to help us read this word properly and not get into it, but you don't have to not use it. So don't be afraid if words are changing. Pete Bauer says, watch the joins on that word matrix because we have spelling changes, but don't be afraid to use those words in your instruction when you're teaching morphology because a lot of it can be oral. And when you're thinking about only properly spelling and only properly reading, we get afraid that we're doing things wrong or we're not supposed to be doing things that way because perhaps it didn't come on our scope and sequence yet.
I'm so glad you brought that up because that goes back to I just posted about this, the whole assessment thing. And like, I think sometimes we focus so much on the grade and you're absolutely right. There's a difference between teaching something where you have in mind, I'm going to teach this to the extent that I can feel okay to assess them on it. And then there's, I'm going to mention this because it's important and I'm not going to ignore that there's this double letter here. I want to mention it and I want to bring it to their attention. And for some kiddos, they're like, got it. And for other students, they're not going to remember that, but they at least have heard it. And so by the time you do explicitly teach it, they're like, oh yeah, you've said that a few times. But I think the key is we don't want to assess students on things we haven't explicitly taught, but that doesn't mean we can't still teach it. We can't still mention it and bring it up in a word matrix, because when I'm doing a first grade word matrix for the word read or teach, I might not have taught a certain prefix, but I still can make that matrix and they have that in their oral language. I'm just not going to ask them to spell that correctly and everything.
And I definitely think introducing it orally and in reading before we expect it of spelling. It's much easier for kiddos to recognize, oh, that says napping, even though there's two P's because there's no additional phoneme added. But then a word like tried, we're going to want to hold off because the Y is changing to an I and it just becomes a little bit messier. But recognizing that it's okay to introduce it, mention it in reading before we expect them to be able to spell it and generate it on their own.
Yeah. Ooh, this is a fun one. Do you use the word morpheme with your students? So this is an interesting question. I feel like early on when I was doing morphology, I wasn't using the word morpheme. I was like, I don't need to use that word. Now I use it all the time with my students, that I can't not use it because I want them to understand the concept of a morpheme. So again, it goes back to what I'm asking them to do. I'm not asking them necessarily, I'm not testing them to define morpheme. But I want them to understand what a morpheme is, because when I'm teaching, I want them to understand that, oh, I'm now teaching another meaningful part. So that's really what it is. It's just a fancy word for a meaningful part. So I have a really hard time now if I don't use the word morpheme, and I want them to understand that words are made up of meaningful parts. And so I think just always pointing out that, like, when I say suffix, when I say base word, which are words I use all the time, those are morphemes. So I started integrating that language into my teaching and my lesson plans and making sure that I'm saying the word morpheme and connecting it with base word and suffix. And so while we're here, I'm just going to, just in case I feel like we haven't defined it yet, a morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning. So morphemes include the base, the suffix, the prefix, and even a connector vowel. So it's important to use that term, I think. And I do think it helps them understand all of it, wrap it all around.
Yeah, no, totally. I do not shy away from using academic language, but at the same time, I'm not to the camp where we overload them. You have to tell me what a diphthong is and like use morphology to explain that to me. Like, no, not at all. But it is making the abstract more concrete. And like you said, I definitely want students to know what a base is, what a prefix is, what a suffix is. And one pet peeve of mine is when I hear educators saying the word ending. Like, what does that mean? The word ending, that could be the ending sound. That can be, what if a word has multiple suffixes, then is only the last suffix the ending? So to be intentional with our language, like, yes, they should know what a suffix is, and the suffix comes after a base, not at the end of the word. So that's another distinction that I think is helpful too.
I was just going to say, I normally say either morpheme or meaning part. I use them kind of interchangeably. I'll just be like, how many meaning parts do you see? Or morphemes, and kind of I'll say a morpheme or a meaning part every time I say it. And I agree with both of you. And Michelle, you would really hone in on this, that I don't get caught up on the minutia of academic language. I will be in Facebook groups where grown adults are arguing with each other over words and the proper terminology. And I always just want to say, if you don't know the difference, does it matter to teach it to our children?
Totally.
So we have to think about what matters. And I do think knowing what a morpheme is matters, because you are knowing that words can be split into parts that are meaningful. And when you can divide words into meaningful parts, then you are able to generate more vocabulary than what you originally had. So yes, I think morpheme matters. Some of it can just go. Like, they don't need to know necessarily Anglo-Saxon, Latin, Greek. I think it is helpful for us as teachers to know, because it can help you figure out the English language a little bit better. But yeah, I don't get caught up too much.
Either. But that one, if it's a useful tool, that's when I use it. If it's useful for my students and it helps them in understanding whatever I'm teaching, then absolutely I want to use that term. But if it's just a term, like diphthongs are a perfect example. I don't care if they know what a diphthong I want them to know the concept behind it, but I don't need them to know that word.
Yeah. And it's like, if you use phoneme, then why not use morpheme? If you use grapheme, then why not use morpheme?
Yeah.
So I feel like a lot of teachers use that terminology, so we don't have to shy away. It is what it is. That's what it is. Our last big question for today is another popular one. This is tied with Savannah's, what's the morphology scope and sequence, right? And this question was, what might a morphology lesson look like in action step by step? So the first thing I want to say is about 15 years ago, there was this meta-analysis with Pete Bowers and friends, and they looked at how morphology instruction is best taught in the classroom. And one of their findings is that it's best when it's integrated into other aspects of literacy. And the other finding is it's best when it includes this problem-solving approach. So that being said, we don't necessarily have to add one extra block into our day. So don't feel overwhelmed like, oh, my literacy block is so full. Now I have to add a morphology block. No. We need to integrate these pieces together. So you would either infuse morphology into your phonics or word study, or you would infuse morphology into your vocabulary routines that you do in your classroom. And then when it comes to investigating words, it just has a better effect than just memorizing a whole bunch of prefixes and suffixes. And we talked about this before. So maybe you don't know the meaning. If I was to say suffix AL, what's that mean? You're like, I have no idea. But you know it in the context of another word, like if I was to say behavioral or coincidental, because now we know that AL is this word-forming element that's creating adjectives. And like we talked about this grammar aspect before. So that all being said, in primary land, I wanted to paint out a picture of one way it could go. And I kind of wrote a little script out for myself so I don't miss anything. But basically, we always follow this gradual release of responsibility model with anything we do, right? I do, we do, you do. So explicit instruction. But when we're taking into that investigation piece, you can use inquiry and this Socratic questioning, and that doesn't mean it's not explicit. It's actually part of the science of learning where we're guiding students to have this just thinking about our language before we're explicitly teaching about it. So let's say we're working on CVC words. I might take one of those words out of my lesson and say, hey, we just did some great work reading these short vowel words. Are you ready for a challenge? I'm going to say some words, and I want you to really think hard with your brains. What do all of these words have in common? And I might say runs, running, runny, and you can have it written down, or you could just say it out loud orally. But really, we want students to tap into their oral language, which this has been a theme of this podcast episode. One student might say, they all begin with the R sound. And you're like, yes, good observation. And another student might say, they all have the short U. Wow, you're right. So you're going to let them grapple with that word set for a bit. And students might notice where you're going, or maybe they don't. And if they don't, this is your explicit teaching, right? Did you notice they all have this base element, RUN, run, in them? And then you'll ask them, I wonder if they have any similarities in meaning. You can go through these words one by one. And again, you don't have to have a large selection of words here, and get them up and moving. Okay, everybody up. Can we run in place? What does that mean to run? It means to move your body quickly, right? How about runs? Can we use that in a sentence? Can I say, I runs to the park? No, that doesn't make sense. Savannah runs to the park, right? So you might even guide them to some irregular words in the moment. Like yesterday, you ran to the park, but right now, this second, you are running. And you're weaving that piece in there. And again, notice and name. We don't have to get into irregular verbs right now, but you're using this language. So then when you're going through your set, maybe you have a tricky one in there. How about runny? This is tricky because now let's think of something that's runny. And maybe you have a little kid who says, oh, Johnny has a runny nose. Or my husband, actually, he likes to eat runny eggs. And that's when the egg yolk kind of spills out of the egg and it runs down. So I guess runny can also show how something moves, and it doesn't always have to be with our legs. Did you notice that they're kind of related? So RUN is what we consider a base word, and we can add a suffix after the base to change its meaning. And I'm going to show you what this looks like on a word matrix. And depending on their familiarity with a matrix, you might need some more in-depth conversations, but you can build out that matrix and show them how it works with just a 2-column matrix. And you can show them how we're reading from left to right. And now we have to be word scientists and make sure we didn't make any mistakes. So we're going to use some word sums to test out our matrix and make sure it works. And we're going to write RUN plus suffix X is rewritten as runs and take them through. For words that have the doubling rule, you're just going to put it there and you're going to tell them, oh, we had to double this one so that it doesn't say Rooney. But we don't have to get into the depths. And then I might ask, can you think of any other words that maybe we can fit in this matrix? Turn and tell your partner. And the rule is really, in order for a word to be on a matrix, it has to have 2 important rules. It has to have the same spelling. So it has to have that RUN piece. And it also has to have the same meaning. So it has to have something to do with movement. So now you let them chat a little bit, you overhear, and you're like, wow, somebody said runner. That was a good one. What's a runner? It's someone who runs, right? And we split it up, RUN, and then the ER suffix. And then I might be dating myself. I don't think kids watch Looney Tunes anymore, but how about Roadrunner? Roadrunner is an animal that runs really, really fast. Talk about background knowledge, right? Like you're infusing all these pieces together. So you don't have to go crazy long here, but you're letting them experience words in different ways, and you're building out their word networks to notice like, hey, I may have thought of runs and running and runner, but I would have never put runny with that base. And this is just getting them to be curious about words and think about words in a different way. And so, you close it out. Wonderful job exploring. Maybe you want a little you-do action where you have them think of one of the new words that we came up with and use it in a sentence and tell their partner. And you might encourage them to use some of these words when they're talking classroom today or in their writing. And again, we're not going to hold them accountable for spelling with spelling changes just yet. But again, we don't have to shy away from using this language because it's important. And this is how we're building up vocabulary. So this is one potential way it can go. I know a lot of people want the lesson plans, but sometimes you have to take into consideration your students and what they know and your classroom, and your students best. So that is just one way a lesson can look.
When I read that question, I was like, ooh, I have 8 different answers because there's, like you said, there's that investigation side where we're just really playing with words and having fun with words. And that's so rich and powerful, and it can be so helpful. And then there's okay, when I teach suffix ED, I do have a lesson plan. I've got a step-by-step. There's things I want to cover. I do. It's so much more structured. But then there's also, it's a rainy day. I posted about this on Instagram and how you can turn a rainy day into a morphology lesson. There's a lot of words kids can come up with on their own. And what we're doing is just bringing awareness to all those words with the base, and then talking about how all those words are different within a sentence. And so you can have that sort of investigation. I've also had those moments where we're reading a book and words come up and kids have a genuine question, and I have derailed my whole plan for the day. I'll never forget one day, I don't remember what we were reading, but it was a 2nd grade group, and I think nature came up, and then the same book, there was native, and someone even said, are those related? And I had not really studied that. I was just hold on. I got my computer and I just started investigating it right there, came up with the base. We came up with other words, and it was so memorable for them because it came, and I kept saying, you were a word detective there. You were the teacher here. You came up with what we did for the day. And it was so powerful. And then we got into some suffixes that we hadn't done yet, but they got it. It didn't matter that I hadn't explicitly taught that part of it. I think it depends. There's no one answer to what a morphology lesson might look like, because there's that investigation side, but then there's also some pre-planned matrices that I might want to do because I know how many words can come out of them. So that would be a more structured lesson and what that might look like.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, when I'm teaching morphology, I do kind of see it as a continuation of my word recognition. So with little guys, I'm doing single syllable words. So I think about like, what is most important when I'm teaching that? And it's, am I giving them enough authentic practice reading and spelling the words that I have taught them that they can become proficient readers? Likewise, when it comes to morphology, I'm asking, have I given them enough authentic practice reading and spelling these morphemes that I have taught them that they are going to be proficient with them, and that they are then able to go and read books and get that generative vocabulary where they are recognizing it. So I still do things like dictation for morphology. There are decodable passages for morphology, but I like to look for morphological elements within the text that we're already reading, because that is the end goal. The end goal is to read whatever you want, and it's not as tidy as teaching phonics, but that's because we're no longer just focusing on word recognition. You cannot teach morphology without also talking about the meaning. And so you're kind of doing double duty once you're teaching morphology, but you're still thinking, have I given them enough that they're going to be proficient?
And it really, the review can kind of spiral too. So by the time I teach vowel teams, right? So that's a phonics concept. That's in my scope and sequence. By the time I've taught vowel teams, I've also taught S, ES, ING, ED, ER, EST. So when I'm doing my dictation or when I'm decoding words, I'm going to first focus on the base words that have vowel teams. And then I'm going to make sure I add in words with those suffixes, because rarely do we just spell a base word without suffixes, right? I mean, especially those inflectional ones. So then I'm reinforcing, and I've taught other rules like the doubling rule, whatever, those kinds of things can kind of feed into that too. So I just think it goes so well with our phonics lessons. So you're totally right, Savannah, on that. It goes with the word study. It goes hand in hand.
ED is such a beautiful example. When I was first Orton Gillingham trained and I learned that ED could represent 3 sounds, I was like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. So I explicitly taught ED can say id or t, and they could tell me that. And then you know what? They sure did still spell looked was LOOKT. And when I reflected on why, it's because I never took it back to meaning. As soon as I started saying, yes, it does sound like that, but what do we know we always put as a suffix if it is going to be past tense? And that is when it started to stick with my kiddos. When I didn't just talk about the sounds, we talked about what it does to the word.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what a powerful way. I know when we read Wiley Blevin's book this summer, one of the things he mentioned is one of the pitfalls of phonics is that we get into multisyllabic words too late. And some multimorphemic words aren't necessarily multisyllabic, but you want to think about, can you integrate some of this into your phonics lessons seamlessly where it's just a little extra? Like at the end of your blending line, can you have one with morphemes? At the end of your word chain, can you do one word with a morpheme at the end? Just so you're like popping it in there regularly. And it doesn't have to be this long drawn out lesson too. It's like this morphology sprinkles.
For sure.
I'll do for dictation. I'll give them a base word like run. We'll just go over this. And then I'll be like, okay, well, how would I spell it if I'm running right now? And it would just be run. Or if it was third person, it could be runs. And then I'm like, okay, now how would I make it past tense? How would I make this into a word that is someone who runs? And I take them through dictation with the same base word, but asking them to do different things with it based off of a definition.
I love a morpheme word chain.
Yeah.
It shows their understanding really well.
It does. It really does.
And that window.
Hope is a good one. So I'll be like,
yes.
What does it mean if you're full of hope, or if you don't have hope, or you're hoping for something right now? So it's a fun one.
I've used the example before of packed. So when I say that, I just am curious, what comes to your mind when you hear packed?
Like I packed a suitcase.
Okay, so you hear the past tense of pack, but there's also like, I made a pact with my friend. And one is a base word on its own, and the other one is a base word with a suffix. And that's a great example to show our students about and talk about using the language of morpheme. One of them has one morpheme, and one of them has 2 morphemes, and but they sound exactly the same. So it helps with those words that sound the same, but we have to think about it in a sentence. So I wouldn't just say the word packed. I'd have to use it in a sentence because they could use that meaning to determine that there's that ED in there, especially since ED represents 3 different sounds. They have to hear that to be like, oh, there's, going to be more than one morpheme there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. That's your PSA. You always include a sentence with your dictation. All right. So those were our meat and potato kind of questions. And now we have a tiny little lightning round. So we're just going to answer this with like a word or 2. Are you ready, ladies? So what book have you found most helpful when it comes to teaching morphology? And go.
William Van Cleve, Everything You Want to Know and Exactly Where to Find It, I think it's called. It's literally what it's called. Everything You Want to Know. It's got word lists. It's you need it. William Van Cleve, Spiral Bound. Beautiful.
That's a good one.
Underneath the Surface of Words.
Ooh, I love a good Sue Hegland.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll pick something different. How about Teaching How the Written Word Works, Peep Hours? We could link all of these in the show notes too. All right, what's your favorite morphology resource that you ever created?
There's a lot. Honestly, instead of a resource, I feel like I'm most proud of my blog posts because my blog posts show my resources, but I am proud of those blog posts because it's sort of like this compilation of 10 years of being inside my head and trying these different things with my students. And I finally have put it together. So I know that's not exactly answering the question, but
we'll allow it. Mine would be Morphology interactive notebooks. I'm obsessed with interactive notebooks. And as soon as I made those, it felt like, oh, okay, I have a starting point. So definitely interactive notebooks.
So fun. And mine probably is I have these Greek and Latin root of the week posters. And what I love about them is I have photography there showing words in different scenarios. So it just brings the word to life in different ways.
And we'll put all this in the show notes too.
All right. What's one morphology nugget that blew your mind when you learned it?
I think early on, it was when I first learned that words like does and said make sense and that morphology explains those spellings. That was my first oh, that's what got me hooked.
Well, now you have to explain it to us.
Okay. So the word does, if we just look at phonology and through that lens, we might think it's D-U-Z and then it's confusing and D-O-E-S seems like it's totally crazy. But the word does is really base word do, D-O, plus suffix es. Then we can look at doing and we can look at done, D-O, plus suffix N-E, which is a retired suffix, but still in some words. And we can compare it to goes, going, and gone, which you can see that spelling is consistent. And it just shows us pronunciation shifts over all these years, but that spelling has stayed intact and it does make sense.
Probably my quick one would be that to spell shun, we use C-I-A-N when we're talking about a person with a job. Politician, electrician, pediatrician. And then the other one would be when somebody finally told me what the CVC doubling rule was. If a base word ends with a consonant, vowel, consonant, you double it before adding a vowel suffix, which sounds like a lot of words and it's going to take a lot of time and practice. But that is why a word like running has 2 N's, but a word like thinking only has 1 K because it's whether or not it ends with a consonant, vowel, consonant before a vowel suffix.
That leads perfectly to mine because mine was actually something I just learned maybe a year or so ago that happy can actually be broken down further. We have a root, HAP, which means chance, luck, and it has suffix Y with the doubling rule.
Ooh.
I know. And you have HAP in words like mishap, perhaps, happen. That's all related. That was a cool one that I was like, whoa, happy actually has a suffix.
I love it.
All right, last question. What's one piece of advice that you'd give to educators who are just getting started with teaching morphology?
I'd say to start exploring words yourself, start getting curious. And when you see a word and you think to yourself, why is it spelled like that? I think learn how to investigate it. So taking some classes with structured word inquiry there's a ton online. And I know that we've talked about it too. I think becoming a word detective yourself as a teacher makes you understand how to communicate that to your students.
And I would just say baby steps. Don't think you have to overhaul everything you're doing. If you haven't started teaching morphology, maybe you just start by picking up something, choosing one thing that you know you can do consistently and stick with it and then add on the other things because otherwise you're going to burn out because you are busy enough without having to add an entire new curriculum to your plate. So just start with something small.
I love it. And my piece of advice is don't be afraid to make mistakes because we all make them. And I still make them today. And this is how you learn something new. So even with my mistakes I've made in morphology along the way, then I was like, oh, this refines my craft. And it just takes you further down the morphology rabbit hole. So mistakes are good. We say it to our kids. It's proof that we're learning. So do not be afraid.
Absolutely.
All right, ladies, this has been so much fun.
So fun.
I am so grateful to have such smart friends to chat with. Thank you so much for tuning into Literacy in Color. I hope today's episode left you feeling both inspired and equipped with something new to add to your teaching toolkit. If you're enjoying this podcast, it would truly mean so much to me if you'd leave a 5-star review. It helps other educators find the show and join our colorful community. And don't forget to hit the follow or subscribe button so you never miss an episode. For more tips, tools, and resources, be sure to check out the links in the show notes at michelleandthecolorfulclassroom.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you next week. Until then, be colorful and teach colorfully.